This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on?
Well, we're talking about the new lawfare, Danny. So, the left tried to destroy Donald Trump with 91 indictments and civil cases and, the 2 impeachments. They threw everything they had at him at the federal, state, and local level, and he survived. And so the resistance is sort of defeated in terms of the campaign of personal destruction. But they're now waging a new form of lawfare, which is to try and stop everything that Donald Trump does in the courts. We've got this new phenomenon, relatively new historically phenomenon of universal injunctions, where you have these district court judges that are just are telling the president of the United States, somebody brings a case to them to oppose something that he's doing, and they just say, nationwide injunction, stop. You can't do it. And the history of this is fascinating because this is a relatively new idea, this universal injunction. There never was one before 1963. And only 27 in the entire 20th century. Donald Trump's first term, there were 64 of them. And then Biden came in and there were 14, which would have been a relatively large amount, but that was 14 in 4 years. And then Trump has come in and there have been 15 in the first 2 months of the Trump presidency. So you've got these Democratic judges, 92% of them are from Democrats, who are basically stymieing the Trump agenda through these, I would argue, illegitimate universal injunctions. What do you think, Danny?
So I couldn't agree with you more about the universal injunctions. Look, again, it's not so much that I always disagree with the decision that the judge has made, because I think there are cases where I think that it's fairly obvious that the Trump administration is actually overstepping the line and that judicial action is required. The problem is, and we discussed this obviously at length with our guest, but the problem is that the judges themselves are overstepping their authority. Basically, what you have is a contest now between the executive branch and the judicial branch to see who can be a better dictator, right? I say...
That's a strong word.
No, hang on. Because I say this advisedly. Again, it's not about being a dictator in the sense of Stalin or Hitler, but it is a dictator in the sense that they are trying to use the powers that the Constitution affords to themselves to assert their position over the other branches and to try to make that the rule. And we saw this in the Biden administration, right? Where the Biden administration said, I can appoint whoever I want. It doesn't matter that the court says that this is not a legitimate agency. I can give money back to whoever I want in the student loan disaster because I'm the president and I get to do it, and who's to tell me not to? This is the other side of that coin, which is the judiciary saying we can assert our power over the policy-making prerogatives of the executive branch. And again, to my mind, the right thing to do is for the Congress of the United States, whether in Democrat or Republican hands, is to go and bitch slap both of them. Unfortunately, there has been no bitch slapping. And instead, we see this contest going on, which I think is enormously corrosive.
Yeah, the reason I sort of cringed at your use of the phrase dictators is because it was the whole, democracy is on the ballot, Trump's going to be a dictator and all the rest of that. And
I believe it dies in darkness, Mark.
Yes. I believe that's not what you meant when you used the phrase.
It isn't.
But it is judicial tyranny. I agree, because you have these 92% of the judges issuing these orders are Democrats, Obama appointees, Biden appointees, who are basically using the judicial system to stymie the president. And in most cases, not all, but most of these cases, I actually agree with the aims that the president is pursuing. Oftentimes, it's not the right means. Like on the birthright citizenship, I think the best course would be to go through Congress, and Congress needs to address this. And sort of doing this through the executive branch, through an executive order, is probably improper and will probably not succeed. Is the bigger problem, is that he's oftentimes pursuing aims that I like, but is doing it in a way that I think he's going to get overturned. And our guest, John Yoo, thinks that he might lose about half of these cases in the Supreme Court, which is, I would like him to be pursuing a more, in some cases, a more thoughtful strategy of how to frame these things in a way that's going to win when he gets to the court. And that's my bigger worry. But I
that's
am
the problem,
deeply
isn't
worried.
it?
But I am deeply worried about this idea that the left is just politicizing the justice system in a new way. They politicized the justice system against him to try and stop him from getting back the presidency, and he utterly defeated them at the polls and, came out of that election with a popular vote victory, a swing state sweep, a mandate from the American people to follow it. Most of these policies that he's pursuing are 70-30, 80-20 issues, like deporting Trende Aragua. I think the New York Times poll, 86% of Americans want to report every criminal alien. And they know they can't win this in the democratic process, so they're trying to use the judiciary to stop him from implementing these policies.
The thing that I talk about with John is this goes around, comes around problem. Every time a norm gets broken, it's not just broken for you, it's broken for everybody. And one of the things that frustrates me in these claims and counterclaims about our democracy being at stake, about our Constitution being torn up, is this failure to admit that there have been excesses on both sides of the aisle. And that, I can't believe that I find myself quoting Mitch McConnell so often. But you know what? What is his mantra? We need to return to regular order. We need to return to Congress doing its job, the executive branch listening to the Congress, the courts listening to the president and to the Congress, and ruling where it is their remit. And instead, everybody's just like, it's a party and I'll do what I want. I do think that the other problem with lawfare, and you can rightly, I think, call it lawfare, is that the president has said the Democrats used the judicial system to attack me. They used the legal profession to attack me. They stretched all bounds of legality in going after me for political purposes. And our listeners know that you and I have had real concerns about the cases that were in Georgia and Florida, as opposed to the cases that were in New York and elsewhere, which were entirely frivolous. And he has said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You want to use lawfare against me? When I get the power, I'm going to use it against you. And he has gone after law firms in Washington. And I got to say, again, these are bastions of the Democratic Party. These are bastions of lack of balance in politics and of elitism in our culture. Nonetheless, Donald Trump, as somebody who has relied for many years on the services of defense lawyers, should recognize that it is a fundamental principle in our country that everybody does actually have the right to a defense. And I think his actions against law firms, I think he's going to get reined in on that. The problem for me is not that he's going to get reined in on that. It is what the next Democratic president is going to do with that precedent. And again, it's always that, okay, I don't like this. Just you wait, because not only are you not going to like it, you're going to dislike it even more when it's in the hands of somebody else.
Yeah, first of all, let me just say I hate a lot of these law firms. You just look at our friend Paul Clement, who was basically fired from his law firm for representing the House of Representatives in the Defense of Marriage Act and winning the Heller case, and had to leave a law firm because a successful Supreme Court victory, which most people would put a press release out, that was just no, we don't do that kind of thing. We don't defend guns, gun makers and gun owners and all the rest of that. And Perkins Coie, the people who gave you the Steele dossier, which is one of the most shameful episodes in American political history, I've got no sympathy for any of these people. And I think that's qualitatively different. John brings up, and I don't want to step too much on our interview, but he says, well, what if one day Kamala Harris becomes president, she goes after the law firms that represented big oil and all the rest of that. that's qualitatively different from what a lot of these law firms were doing, which was trying to destroy the president of the United States and pursue him in this lawfare.
We don't agree about that.
But it doesn't matter, because they will just take the president and drive a truck through it and use it in the other way. So I'm sympathetic to his feeling that these people went after me and now I'm going to go after them. But I think he should go back to what he said at the start of his presidency, which is the success is the best revenge, and this may undermine success.
Yeah, well, that is wise counsel to the president, and I hope he listens to you. So let's get to our guest. Everybody knows who he is because we've had him so many times before, because we love him. John Yoo is the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, that fine institution, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and Stanford. And he is now, this is not in our bio of him, but we know this, he is now also working with the Civitas Institute, which is being led by our former colleague, Brian Streeter, down at the University of Texas. Just a great place. John clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. He was the general counsel of the Judiciary Committee. I'm not going to go any further with his resume because it's too long. He's great. We love him.
Here's our interview. John, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. This is my favorite AEI podcast. In fact, does AEI have any other podcasts? Not that I know of.
Well, that's right. They're all dust beneath our chariot wheels.
Well, now we're going to finally get some ratings because we got John Yoo on the podcast. So everyone will be tuning in with bated breath to hear what you have to say.
Prepare for the hate mail. Prepare.
Oh, we get our share of hate mail, believe me.
No, come on. You two unite the pro-torture constituency, so I missed hearing from them.
I'm gonna reach back in that tool book a little bit later in the podcast, but I want to start out with all these nationwide injunctions that are happening, John. I was looking at some of the numbers, and in the entire 20th century, there were only 27 nationwide injunctions by district judges. Under Trump's first term, 64 in his first term. Biden had 14 in his entire 4 years. Now we've had 15 in the first 2 months of the Trump administration. What is going on with these nationwide injunctions? And is this the new lawfare?
Well, nationwide injunctions are new, and they are controversial, and they have yet to be blessed by the Supreme Court. When you say nationwide injunction, you mean a single trial judge, federal district judge, of which there are about 675 in the country, every major city. Many small towns have them. You might be on the subway right next to a federal district judge, and you'll never know because you don't have no idea who these people are. They're hiding.
Read me with an order.
They're like one of these Marvel vigilante heroes sitting amongst us like regular civilians. This is a case when one of them hears some kind of claim that a government policy is illegal from a plaintiff. And rather than just saying in their judgment to the government, stop doing this to this plaintiff, this person in my courtroom, they also then go farther and say, I am barring the government entirely, nationwide, from following this policy. And as you say, Mark, this is a relatively new phenomenon. And if you look at the numbers, Trump's going to break all records. And that's all he cares about. He wants to break the record. So he's going to definitely break the record for nationwide injunctions if he didn't break it his first term. I think there's something like 60 cases going right now, if not more, against different aspects of Trump's executive orders. Now, this is also not a Republican Democrat thing or even conservative liberal thing. Remember, under the Biden administration and the Obama administration, there were nationwide injunctions against Obamacare, against the DACA and DAPA immigration programs, against abortion pill policy. But it is seeming to, and this goes to your lawfare point, Mark, it does seem to be crescendoing under the Trump administration in a way it hasn't under previous presidents.
So, John, I think that's right. Certainly as a sort of, just as a matter of observation and counting the judgments. But it's also true that Trump has issued more executive orders in a shorter period of time than almost any president in history, and that he is pursuing a policy of testing the boundaries on a whole variety of issues, whether it's immigration or it's birthright citizenship or it's the Impoundment Act. And so, I mean, there is a sort of a garbage in, garbage out element to this, isn't there?
And that's quite right, Danny. If Trump had simply continued Biden's policies in place, there'd be no lawsuits. Right? There'd be no nationwide injunctions. But because it's because he has radically changed a lot of these policies that you should not expect there. You shouldn't be surprised to see huge amounts of lawsuits and litigation, which, since we're all Senate hands, is actually a sign, isn't it, of Democratic weakness in Congress. Because the number one branch, the place you should go if you oppose the executive branch policies and executive orders, is Congress. That's what the founders intended. They intended the Congress to be the most, the most vigorous, powerful branch. Going to the courts is actually a sign of political weakness.
That is so true. I mean, this has been one of my bajillion rants over the last 2 months, is that in every case we see Congress incredibly supine, just not at all responsive to the demands on it by the Trump administration, to the demands on it by the people. And you know what encapsulates this perfectly? Even as Trump is upending everything, Congress is doing a continuing resolution to fund the government, i.e., it is using last year's Biden budget to fund the government. That's how little Congress is doing. But I wanted to follow up with you. I don't always associate Donald Trump's moves with a strategy, but it seems in the case of this back and forth and the lawfare response that there is, that actually Trump is trying to get certain interpretations of the Constitution changed in his first couple of years. The Impoundment Act being one of them, and the second one, I think, being birthright citizenship. And that he is actually pursuing a very deliberate strategy to actually excite legal action in order to get to the Supreme Court for a judgment. Do you agree that that's the case?
Oh, Danny, that's a great point, and I think completely right. And I also think within the president's prerogatives, and this goes to these deeper arguments we've had in constitutional law for a long time about the president having the right to interpret the Constitution too, sometime at odds with past precedent, and trying to use control over the Justice Department and law enforcement to get the court to change its mind. Presidents have always done this. So there's nothing wrong with it. Maybe to make the point even stronger, Danny, is the Supreme Court itself is calling on President Trump to do this in some of these areas. So you could think of what Trump's doing, and there's two different kinds of these executive orders. One is about how do you manage the executive branch, just agencies and the president. And then the second class, and this would include firing people, impoundment, downsizing the government. The second kind is affecting the rights and duties of people like you and me, private citizens, our rights. In the first area, the Supreme Court over the last 25 years under the Roberts Court, has been striking down efforts to make agencies independent of presidential control, has been striking down efforts to dilute the president's control over the enforcement of federal law. So in that area, you could almost say the Supreme Court has gradually been inviting presidents to come to court and say, overturn this precedent from 1935, get rid of the NLRB. Those, I think Trump's going to be very successful. The other kind, Danny, what you mentioned, birthright citizenship, I don't think he's going to fare as well, because that's an effort to change the rights of millions of people and to overthrow a Supreme Court case from the late 1890s. There, the Supreme Court has not been inviting Trump to come in and say, upend the order. And so you're right. In both cases, he's aggressively pushing his own interpretation of the Constitution. He's allowed to do that. But I think this leads to him getting kind of a 50-50 win rate ultimately at the Supreme Court.
So I want to stay on this at 30,000 feet on these universal injunctions. There are a lot of people who argue that universal injunctions are illegitimate. One person said, this is a quote, "Universal remedies are inconsistent with longstanding limits on equitable relief and the power of Article 3 courts and impose a severe toll on the federal court system." That was Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar of the Biden administration. The Biden administration went to court and said that these universal injunctions are illegitimate. Was the Biden administration right?
This is one of the few times you'll hear me say yes. No, actually, that's not true. But yes, actually, I think this is not her idea. It's not acting SG Sarah Harris's idea, who I know quite well. It is Clarence Thomas's idea.
Someone you know well.
I have to say I clerked for. And I tend to think he's right on a lot of things. Not everything, I must confess. Sometimes we disagree, but on most things. And you might remember the Hawaii versus Trump case, the alleged Muslim travel ban case. That was a major nationwide injunction where a judge in Hawaii basically stopped the government from blocking people from coming from countries where the president in his good faith belief thought that there were terrorist threats. And the court reversed in Trump's favor. And Justice Thomas wrote a concurrence saying, we also got to take care of, and this is 2018, we got to take care of these nationwide injunctions. They are unconstitutional. Even if Congress wanted to issue them, Justice Thomas said, we shouldn't do it because we're not deciding a case of controversy between the parties in front of us. Courts are not designed to set nationwide policy. I think he continues to be right.
Well, that's always a good guess. What is the difference between a universal injunction and a temporary restraining order, which some judges are putting in some of these cases? Is it just a different name for the same thing, or does it have a different purpose?
What the hell is this? The bar exam? I probably got this wrong on the bar exam. You're probably asking me the one question I got wrong. I got 99%. Jesus. So,
well, if Danny and I are throwing guns, then you'll pass because we don't know the answer. So, even if you get it wrong.
So nationwide injunction or any injunction is the relief. So that's after the case is done. And say with a birthright citizenship, the judge says, you can't take away the citizenship of these plaintiffs who sued. I issue an injunction. That's your relief. That's what you win at the end, the remedy. A TRO is at the very beginning of the case. It's not permanent. It says temporary restraining order. It says, before I hold the trial, before I hear the case, I want to freeze everything in place because otherwise people will continue to do things and it'll cause so much harm to the plaintiffs right now that by the time I get to the case, it'll all be over. So think about the case we're talking about, the Venezuelan gang members, Tren Aragua. Right? I hope I rolled my R correctly. So the government, the plaintiffs, there's some, it's not all all the people on the plane did not have lawyers, but I think 6 of them did. And they said, we need a TRO because by the time you actually hear the case, they'll all be in El Salvador in this maximum security prison. That's a classic example of when you might issue a TRO. They're supposed to expire in just like a week or so, 12 days, I think. And so judges are also using TROs, right, to stop the government nationwide. And then they have the case, and then they issue an injunction at the end, which is a permanent, right, block on the government. But these TROs suffer from the same problem. Justice Thomas's concurrence in the travel ban case applies to TROs as well as permanent injunctions. His point is Article 3 of the Constitution says we decide cases or controversies. That means we only decide disputes between the plaintiffs who show up and the defendants who show up in the courtroom. Our power as judges does not extend to anyone else outside. We don't have the right to say, not only do you have to not send these 6 Venezuelans out of the country, you have to not send anybody to El Salvador or anybody back to Venezuela. That, Justice Thomas thinks, is not within the power of the federal courts. That's more like policymaking than settling a dispute. So this one important thing is the Supreme Court could fix this problem right away if it wants to. In any of these cases that Danny mentioned coming up to the Supreme Court, they could say, we may affirm, we may reverse on the merits, but we are ending these wayward district judges who are issuing these nationwide injunctions.
So can you explain to our listeners how this ends up in the Supreme Court and how the decision gets made? I understand how the individual cases, the individual stays, individual injunctions, but how does the court actually address the question of the lawfulness and constitutionality of universal injunctions?
That would be very easy to, because the court got the case right now. There, as you mentioned, Danny, there's several challenges to President Trump's executive order trying to end birthright citizenship. I have to say on the merits, I don't think he has that power, and I think he's going to lose. But there's, I think, 6 district judges now who all issued universal injunctions against this, and they have a case at so the government, the Trump administration, has a case at the Supreme Court that asks it end these nationwide injunctions. So the court could do it. They could grant that case for certiorari like right now. And the Trump SG made the exact same argument that the Biden SG, the SG Solicitor General, who argues cases for the court for the United States, she's made the exact same argument. These are unconstitutional. Step in right now, end the practice. So it could be like right away, almost.
So it's really, I know I'm asking basic questions because I'm only a fake lawyer, as you know all too well.
You'd make a great bar examiner, though.
There you go. Although on my own non-existent bar, I obviously received a 0.
And also a fake doctor.
Also a fake doctor. That's true. I am a fake doctor. I may well be a fake scholar. Who knows? But
I wasn't going to say it, but
I took the words out of your mouth, Mark. But so, John, one of the things that is a little bit hard for me to understand in the current environment, in which we have in some ways defaulted to being not a 3-branch system of checks and balances, but a 2-branch system of checks and balances, in which Congress just lies there, and so to speak, and the executive branch and the courts do battle. But what we're seeing in terms of the courts is not simply at the appellate level or even at the federal level. We're seeing these decisions coming down at the local level, at other levels. Help me understand, if the Supreme Court says there's no such thing anymore as universal jurisdiction, does that shut them all down? Or are there then, as with DEI, efforts to rename, weasel around, work around? How does it work?
One thing that should be clear to people is that if you get rid of universal injunctions, you can still go to court and challenge the government's policies on the merits. It just means that if Trump loses or the government loses, it only stops with regard to that case. They can still continue the policy in other parts of the country or towards other plaintiffs until they sue too. So it doesn't take away anyone, the right to go to court and say, I don't like this policy, I don't like that policy. Mind you, it only applies to federal court, but since this is only federal government as a defendant, no state courts are going to be involved anyway. That doesn't get to the other problem. You're quite right, Danny. And this is, look, what you just described, colleges and universities, companies fighting against some part of the Trump agenda I agree with, restoring colorblindness as a constitutional principle. That's not going to stop them from weaseling around, changing the names of programs, trying to slip out of the fingers of the government and practice, right, what I think of as reverse discrimination on the sly. This is unfortunately a tactic that the Southerners pursued after Brown versus Board of Education. They engaged in massive resistance to Brown until the late 60s and did exactly what you say. The government would say, can't have segregated public schools. So some Southern cities just made all the schools private schools. Right? They went to the same lengths, I think, that we're going to see the diversity industry start to go to cover up the use of race. That just means, you're right, Danny, that you're going to have to sue every time these universities do this, right? The government's still going to have, or you're going to see this, Trump administration is pursuing Harvard, it's pursuing Columbia, it's going to pursue Berkeley, I think, for use of race in admissions and use of race in hiring faculty. Those places will just rename their diversity officers. I think they're renaming them into belonging officers, which is belonging officers. I was like, is that where you leave your personal belongings with them before you have to go into the skiff or something? So these belonging officers. So you're going to have to sue again and again. And you're right, Danny, that is still going to be a feature of fighting tooth and nail against people like the diversity business.
I find it fascinating that the left is using essentially Jim Crow tactics to push their 21st century racist policies the same way as the Jim Crow South did in the 60s. That's just a fascinating analogy. But going back to this idea of, it only applies in a universal injunction really shouldn't be universal. It should apply to just the defendants in the case or the litigants in the case. So what that means is in the case of like the Tren de Aragua flight, it would only apply to if only 6 of them had lawyers, then the judge can only rule for the 6 people who had lawyers and were litigating, not for an entire plane load of people, in order the president to bring it back. And also, what do you make of that case in terms of, the Trump administration didn't comply with the judge's order, said the flight was over international waters and the court didn't have any jurisdiction. We appealed to that argument during the war on terror in terms of habeas corpus and why we didn't bring a lot of the terrorists back into the United States. What do you think of that argument in terms of this case?
Oh, Mark, you're bringing me back down memory lane.
Exactly. The good old days of the war on terror.
And the 3 Supreme Court Gitmo cases. So if you analogize to those cases, I think there's 2 questions. Do the courts have the power to review this decision? And then second, what's the right decision? Because the president and Congress have the responsibility to obey the Constitution too. So first, I think like those Guantanamo Bay cases, Trump, I think, is making a fair argument that courts should not be involved in deciding whether a war is going on. In fact, if you look at this case itself, both the trial judge and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which upheld the trial judge, think that have reached the question. They say there's no invasion going on, right? The Alien Enemies Act, which the Trump administration has invoked, requires either a declared war, an invasion, or a predatory incursion. I love the way people wrote in 1798. Right? These days, can you imagine what Congress would, with what, mumbleese they would turn into predatory incursion? It would be like the crossing of an internationally recognized border by thousands of slightly organized people. So one is, do the courts have that power? And I would say probably not. The Supreme Court has never approved lower courts second guessing, including the Gitmo cases, whether the president and Congress have decided there's a war or invasion. In fact, every time they've either upheld the government or refused to decide.
Well, even in that case, so Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization, just like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. So if you hold that there's not an invasion under this law, then you couldn't have applied the Alien Enemies Act to Al-Qaeda because there was no predatory incursion on 9/11.
Did they apply the Alien Enemies Act to Al-Qaeda? No, they didn't.
But you could. The point is that this is a foreign enemy. We were at war with Al-Qaeda. We were at war with ISIS. And we're at war with Tren de Aragua. Is that a fair argument for the president to make?
Yes, yeah. No, I think that's... So this gets me to the second part is put aside whether the courts can review this at all. If you're in the White House or you're at the Justice Department or you're in Congress, you're the General Counsel of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, what do you think is the right answer? So this is where I'm a little dubious because... And this is why I think it's more like Al-Qaeda, perhaps, than what the administration is claiming. The statute also says that this declared war, invasion, or predatory incursion has to be conducted by a hostile nation or government. And so the Trump administration, that's why it's different than Al-Qaeda, because remember back in 9/11, we were very careful to say Al-Qaeda is not acting on behalf of any country.
Yes.
Here, the Trump administration has to have a factual predicate to say, actually, this Tren de Aragua is an arm of the Venezuelan government. I haven't seen, they've made the claim. I haven't seen the evidence. Why is it no different than
he always says
a variety of narco
the prisons and the mental asylums and sending all their criminals here.
Yeah.
So that's.
We could have used this against the Cubans during the Mariel boat lift then, or the FARC, or you could go through. The terrorist groups just they succeed and are able to operate doesn't mean they're arms of the government. That's the key. And then also the implication is under the statute. If this is true, then we are actually in a state of war with Venezuela. And if we're at a state of war with Venezuela, then not only can we kick all Venezuelans out of the country who aren't citizens, including, green card holders, we can invade Venezuela. We could assassinate Maduro and the Venezuelan generals in charge. We'd be in a state of war.
Now you're talking, John.
Yes. The one thing that I say to myself in all of these conversations is, yes, and what would a Democratic president do? And I don't want to give, and I don't want to be loose about this in the same way. So, John, did you say what you thought about the Trump administration's decision not to obey the judge's order?
No. So they're playing cutesy with this, and they may well lose on this. And this is unfortunate because it's going to affect the way the case comes to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts and some of the people in the middle of the court who I would say like Brett Kavanaugh and maybe Amy Coney Barrett were worried about the institutional image of the court. They're not going to like that the Trump Justice Department showed up and the judge said, turn the plane around, and they let the plane go anyway. Now, their cutesy parties are saying, then the judge wrote the order summarizing the case, and in the written order, it didn't say turn the planes around, and by that time, they were gone. That is not going to fly, so to speak, I don't think. Everything a judge says in a courtroom is the order. Most things that judges rule on in their trials are not reduced to writing. Like they say, I deny this witness, or I overrule that objection. Most of those are never written down, but they sure have the force of law in that courtroom. So I think the problem is that because it's going to come up not as just an issue of, is this an Alien Entities Act case? Should they use immigration law? What due process rights do they get? But it's going to have the aura about it of a defiance of a judicial order. And one little piece of history, the executive branch has never defied a judicial order as far as I know, except in one case, and that was when Abraham Lincoln refused to obey an order from Chief Justice Taney, the author of Dred Scott, to release Confederate prisoners captured at the outbreak of the Civil War. I think the circumstances are a little bit different today than they were then and would not justify even the smell of defying a judicial order. It'd be a terrible tactical mistake on the part of the Justice Department and the Trump administration to have it wrapped up with this.
But you've said that presidents do not have a constitutional obligation to always follow judicial orders. What are the circumstances under which, you've given the one example, only time it's been done, but theoretically you're arguing that it could be done in other circumstances. What are the circumstances that would allow a president to defy a judicial order versus one that he has no choice but to follow?
I think there would be a legal and then sort of a statesmanship time. The legal time would be when the president is convinced that the Supreme Court itself is violating the Constitution. Because the president's constitutional responsibility is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. That's the phrase from Article 3 of the Constitution. The Constitution is the highest law. It sits above the decisions of any individual branch of government. So suppose the Supreme Court said, we're only going to hire white law clerks throughout the system. I think the president could say that's unconstitutional. The Supreme Court can't do that. That's basically akin to what President Lincoln was saying. So that's one. It's not just willy-nilly. It has to be somewhere where the president honestly believes the Supreme Court itself is violating its oath to the Constitution. But then two, I think only at times of importance. I would say, we've seen examples where presidents have fought with the Supreme Court, and maybe those might have been times. A great example is Andrew Jackson, who came close, who vetoed the Bank of the United States, the precursor to the Federal Reserve. Maybe there's some guys at AEI, our gold friends, who would like that to be the case today. By the time Jackson was signing legislation to renew the Bank of the United States, it had already been upheld by the Supreme Court in McCulloch versus Maryland. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton thought it was constitutional. Washington signed the first bill. James Madison thought it was constitutional. He renewed it. Congress clearly did because they kept passing it. And despite that, Jackson's where the theory actually comes from. He said a president's opinion on the Constitution is equal to the Supreme Court's in the areas that he is in charge of. And so he said, the opinions of the justices, they don't bind me, just the way my opinion doesn't bind them. And so he said, when I choose to use the veto, I can veto things I think are unconstitutional, even if everyone thinks they're fine, and vice versa. So I think that's it. When you have these moments of crisis, and I think that's when a president might be justified. I don't think we're in that moment of crisis now. Today, I think we're just in the normal. I don't think we're in a constitutional crisis either. I think the left is exaggerating that. I think we are in the normal give and take of the separation of powers. The framers designed the separation of powers to encourage fighting between the three branches, and I think that's all we're witnessing now.
I wish we were seeing more fighting from some branches, as I've already stated. Let me change gears for a sec, because another element of lawfare that I think is new is the White House's decision to go after what the president likes to term big law. Now, I have opinions about big law because a lot of folks we know in Washington are a part of it. And a lot of us feel, kind of sympathetic that a lot of law firms really do represent very much one side of the political spectrum and not the other. On the other hand, the president has now gone after a pretty big group of large law firms for the perceived crime of defending his political adversaries, for the perceived crime of hiring somebody, Robert Mueller in this case, who had been investigating whether Trump had committed an impeachable crime. I want to know what you think about this as
Or
a
the
lawyer.
not so perceived crime of being the chief spreader of the Steele dossier in the case of Perkins Coie, which was one of the biggest, led to the whole Mueller probe and the Russia collusion conspiracy theory that tied up his presidency for 2 years. Not a perceived crime in the
Okay,
small
well,
state.
we will give the president Perkins Coie.
Thank you.
I still want to know what you think.
Well, at first, I think it's just a political mistake, but legally, I think it's threatening a dangerous principle of the right to representation. But in some ways, you could see what Trump is doing as again, just amplifying or taking to the next level, turning the dial to 11, volume 11. Kids don't even know what the hell I'm
Spinal
talking
Tap
about.
2
They
is
never
coming
watched,
out.
yeah,
Spinal
they
Tap
never
2 is
watched
coming out.
Spinal
They're all
Tap,
gonna know.
but they're like, what is this dial you speak of that you turn? How quaint. It goes to 11. It doesn't even have numbers on it anymore. So think about what the Biden people did, right? Now, agree or disagree with them, and I disagreed with them. But, these lawyers who worked for Trump on the January 6th stuff and on the effort to turn aside the electoral count, all those lawyers got prosecuted or they're getting disbarred, right?
Great point.
Already the legal system went after the lawyers who I think were misguided, but I think in good faith believed what they were doing. I actually testified before the California Bar Association not to disbar John Eastman, even though I totally disagreed with him on the merits. And one thing I said to them, and they went ahead and disbarred him, but what I said to them is, if this idea that you have of disbarring people you disagree with had been around at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, there'd be no Brown versus Board of Education because the southern states would disbar Thurgood Marshall and every lawyer who worked for the NAACP who were saying overturn Plessy, which had been on the books for 70 years. And the whole southern legal system was built around this. You can't go around and punish the lawyers for doing making the best arguments for their clients. And I worry that's what's going on here is that, these law firms have clients and they ask them to do something within reasonable view of the law. And President Trump's EOs are punishing the firms for that. I think that's an effort. It may be unconstitutional under the First Amendment, but that's an effort to interfere with the right to counsel. Now, the thing is, but it's like a lot of things Trump does. At the core of it, there is some truth to it. I think these law firms, some of them were involved, as Mark said, with concocting the Steele dossier, spreading it. I would say, though, that you can just use the normal criminal and civil laws to go after them. Like if they did something actually illegal, then the government has the right to investigate Perkins Coie to see what they were. I actually think it's kind of wrong, a mistake to go after Bob Mueller and the people who helped him, because Mueller is the one who cleared Trump of the Russian dossier. Actually, I remember at the time I was like, Trump shouldn't be attacking Mueller. This guy is the gold standard. He's the greatest federal prosecutor of my lifetime. If he says the Russia dossier was a hoax, it would be conclusive, and it was, right? Like he actually is the one who cleared Trump. I think it's a huge mistake, but I also think it's going to prevent regular people from, like you and me, from exercising our right to counsel, which is also guaranteed under the Constitution if the president and the administration attacks law firms who, right, are on the representation side of that. I actually think it's a bad mistake, putting aside that they're going to lose in court, I think. But it's just, what is the point? But I do see it as a crescendo of things that started under the last administration, too.
So one of the sanctions that they've done on some of these law firms is taking away their security clearances of the lawyers in these firms who are practicing in the international sphere. I mean, that's president's power to do that is pretty much absolute.
Unreviewable.
Yeah, he can take away
He
anybody's
can do that.
security clearance he wants, right?
Yeah, of course. The problem is saying any government contracts with any of them are canceled and they're not allowed to step foot in government buildings, which I don't understand. The last time I checked, courtrooms are also government buildings. So how are these guys going to actually be able to go to court? Right? The classified security clearances he can't lose on that. But that's just a tiny part of what's.
Yeah.
That's not going to affect the law firms. It's the not being able to appear in court is a problem.
Can I ask you a technical question? Andy McCarthy, who we often have on the podcast and who is also a lawyer like you and who I think shares your perspective on this, described the president's actions as a bill of attainder under the Constitution.
It's not right, I'm afraid.
in the further Danny Pletka giving you the bar exam once again.
I know.
Help me understand. What is
Any
his
answer's
argument
correct, John.
Luckily you can't see this on a podcast, but I have my super old man, super-sized text of the Constitution here. It's a super giant version.
And highlighted, no less. So help us understand why you think that argument is not as strong as it should be.
Well, I rarely disagree with Andy on things, but I think this one, it's just a technical error. The Bill of Attainder, so the Constitution prohibits a Bill of Attainder when it's done by Congress. So the technical issue is just this is an executive order from the president, so it just doesn't qualify as a Bill of Attainder. Now, the idea is the principle of a Bill of Attainder is that Congress should not pass a law that targets one specific person or a specific company for punishment. This was something that the Parliament liked to do. English kings had other ways to do this. And so I think the founders properly barred it. But it couldn't possibly apply to the executive branch because every time the executive branch prosecutes somebody, it's singling out somebody for violating the law and going after them. So I think Andy really means it's the principle of a Bill of Attainder that's really, at work here.
Fair enough. But it's unseemly. I think we can agree.
So I'm going to go back to Danny's bugaboo, which is Congress. So Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution authorizes Congress to create and organize the federal courts. So the solution to this universal jurisdiction issue really shouldn't be the Supreme Court, should it? It should be Congress. Congress can pass legislation to simply stop this practice, couldn't they? And I think Mike Lee has a bill that would put national injunctions reserved for 3-judge panels. I think Chuck Grassley has a bill that he's introduced. I think Devin Nunes has one. What should Congress do if you were advising the Speaker or Senator Thune on how to address this issue? What would you advise?
I completely agree, Mark, that Congress could fix this easily. First of all, Congress has never authorized these injunctions. So all they have to do is make clear which was something the Supreme Court could decide anyway, which is that these judges were never given the power to do this. It would just take like a half a sentence addition to the law. And by the way, this is something that Congress does, like the flag burning override bill. There's lots of examples of voting rights. There's lots of examples where Congress knows important constitutional issues are coming, and they create a special accelerated process to get up to the Supreme Court as soon as possible. So they know how to design for this problem. They just could do it generally. But the larger issue, Mark, I'd say is that if you think about this fight between Trump and his challengers in the courts, Congress could solve most of these problems. A lot of the reasons these are proceeding in the courts is because Congress is silent. And President Trump should want Congress involved there. It's controlled by Republicans, his own party. And anything Trump does is going to be ephemeral. It's going to pass so quickly unless Congress codifies it. Everything he's done can be reversed by the next Democratic president. Or maybe this is worse. Everything he does can be done by a Democratic president just with the gun aimed in the opposite partisan direction. And so he should get Congress involved to do things like end nationwide injunctions, to do things like make clear the impoundment rules, or to get rid of or to approve all the rescissions that this Doge committee is coming up with. And that would solve a lot of these problems that we're seeing resolved in the courts. But that's just because Congress is institutionally absent.
So one of my biggest complaints about Donald Trump is actually that goes to 11 problem that you describe, right? It's not that I disagree. We need to resize the federal government. We need to fix federal agencies. We need to get rid of people who are working in this government who don't support its actions. We need to do a whole bunch of things. And frankly, we need to do a lot more of them than what we're seeing Elon Musk doing. My biggest concern with Trump is the what goes around comes around problem, right? Where did we start? We didn't start with Donald Trump. We started with Barack Obama. Mark and I have talked about this with you and with other guests as well. When Barack Obama turned around and said, I don't need to obey the law, I can choose not to enforce it. Right? He opened the door to Donald Trump choosing not to enforce the law on TikTok and a whole bunch of other things. And now that door is wide open, right? And there's a complexity in finding somebody with standing to actually take him to court to oppose it. And it is a mare's nest of lawlessness that began there. Without seeking to ascribe blame, oh, this started with Obama, this was Biden, he did it too, what about him? What, in your worst case scenario imagination, can you look at the outcome of the next Democratic president doing with the doors that have been opened to him in the last few months?
It's a great question. Although I like to blame people more than you, Danny. Dan, you're such a warm, open-hearted person. I'm a vindictive, nasty Korean guy who I think you're responsible for this. You're responsible for that. No fun for you.
Words that have literally never been said.
I would say
before.
no, but I agree. But I agree with your identification of the break, the time it turned. And I wrote a piece about it at the time when President Obama created the DACA program and said, I don't have to enforce immigration law against 10 million people, against 14 million people, based on their character, based not on us can't catch them or they're not felons, just based on I think everybody should be here or something. And Congress won't pass my law. So my DACA law, so I'm just not going to enforce any of the laws. And so think about, that opened the door to presidents saying, I just refuse to obey the laws that I don't like for policy reasons. Trump's going to do that just as much as Obama's going to do that. So the other thing that Obama and Biden did is they kind of governed by declared emergencies. Biden in particular with COVID tried to, require vaccinations nationwide, tried to end all evictions from apartments in the country, and so on. So think about what, say, who would it be, Buttigieg could do with this. So one thing they could clearly do now, unfortunately, I think, is particularly, I'm glad we didn't talk about tariffs and trade barring, but, the declaration of an emergency for tariff purposes, and then, using the IEPA law to, so what, President Buttigieg could say, or let's be frank, President Kamala Harris, she could say climate change is a national emergency. And so because of climate change, I am going to issue orders under IEPA and the Defense Production Act that totally take over the economy. She could do that under these kinds of precedents. And I will punish the law firms and lobbying firms that defend big oil, big pollution. Right? If this precedent works. And I will not prosecute any people who are vandalizing Tesla dealerships or pipelines or energy oil company facilities. Right? So just instead of the Trump agenda, substitute climate change agenda. Right? And I will require DEI programs for all government contractors. And they shall also pay faith to the climate change agenda. So you're right, it could go quite far if the same tools are used by a Democratic president too.
Well, you've convinced me, John, with that argument right there. But one of the things, though, that I think gets overlooked is that except for the El Salvador flight, I don't think Trump has defied any of these court orders. It was Biden who, when the Supreme Court ruled his, student loan debt cancellation unconstitutional, and he said, well, the Supreme Court ruled against me, but I defied them, and was very proud that he found a way around it to do it anyway. It doesn't seem like there's a constitutional crisis in the sense that Trump is, with the exception of this one case where he's making a very discreet argument, that he's defying a actual court order. If the litigation goes forward on TikTok, where he's not enforcing the law and the court rules against him, then he'll probably comply with that. Is this of a different order in what Trump is doing than what other presidents have done?
Oh, yeah. First of all, I think all these accusations that the Trump administration is actually defying judicial orders is premature and exaggerated, because what counts is when it gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upholds the Judge Boasberg in the D.C. Circuit. I don't expect Trump to defy that order. I think he's already said on Fox. So it must be, if he said it and it's on Fox, it's got to be true, right? So if he said it on Fox, He's already said, we will not defy judicial order. He probably said it to Thiessen. Thiessen was probably the guy asking the questions you see off camera. He didn't even know he's there. Also, Thiessen has lost so much weight. He's so skinny, the camera can't focus on him anymore. So look, so I don't expect Trump to do. I think the second order thing, which I think is a mistake on Trump's part, although he's not responsible for most of it, all this attack on the judiciary, claiming we're going to impeach judges, that Boasberg should be impeached. First of all, that's just a pipe dream. There are not enough votes in the Senate to impeach. Second, I don't think our system should impeach judges for just getting things wrong. That's why we have an appellate court. We wouldn't need appellate judges on the Supreme Court if trial judges got it right all the time. So I think that's a mistake too, to unleash this we're going to impeach strategy. However, I don't think John Roberts should have gone out there in public and acknowledged all that talk and said, don't call for impeachments. Judges should just shut up, ignore the political process and what's going on in politics, and just decide the cases and do their jobs. That's why they have lifetime tenure. But this gets to your both point and my point too. But this is also a continuation of the Biden administration. Which administration first started launching these attacks on judges? President Biden wanted to impose term limits on the justices. His party wanted to pack the court. Chuck Schumer attacked, warned the justices that they wouldn't know what would hit them if they overruled Roe. And you've seen all these ProPublica attacks. Yeah, you'll reap the whirlwind like I'm going to in the primary from AOC. Good God. And you've seen, you saw these attacks on the ethics of the justices by left-wing media outfits. So really, who started this assault on the independence of the judiciary? Again, Trump's just turning the dial to 11, but it got to 10 under Biden.
You and your whataboutism. I love whataboutism.
Forget about it, Mark. Forget about it.
I've always hated the whataboutism argument. It's like, okay, let's not point out hypocrisy.
Yeah, no, I just said that to a friend yesterday. I couldn't agree with you more. It has become the last refuge of the scoundrels argument and the Democrats.
I can't refute you, so therefore I will just dismiss your argument.
Okay, so what about that John Yoo, though? He was great. Yay, thank you for joining us.
So, Danny, what did you think?
So I think we really actually covered the issues well, and I think John brought us a really balanced perspective on the good, the bad, and the ugly. But what stays with me, and part of this is because you worked in the Senate, I worked in the Senate, John worked in the Senate, is just how dead our legislative branch is. I know a lot of members of Congress. You know a lot of members of Congress. I know a lot of staff. Still to this day, these are people who are working, they're serving their country, contrary to what many people believe. They're not getting paid a ton of money. But damn, they are not doing their job in so many ways. People rant about Elon Musk, and the answer is Elon Musk is doing it because Congress didn't. Congress was writing those checks. Congress should have been stopping those checks from being cashed. Congress should have reduced those checks. Congress should be dealing with a lot of the issues that concern President Trump, rightfully so, whether it is the predations of anti-Semitism on campus or the presence of terrorists having green cards and visas. All of these things are in the purview of the United States Congress. They are the ones who wrote the laws, and I just don't get what they're spending their time doing.
Well, I guess the answer to that, I share your concerns about that, but the answer to that is just rewatch the State of the Union. Just rewatch the State of the Union and look at that congressman from Texas standing up and yelling at the president and waving his cane, yelling, "Get off my lawn," the way he did during that. And when Trump says, these people, if I cured cancer, they wouldn't even stand up and applaud. And then he introduces a boy who survived brain cancer and they sit on their hands. There's such partisan hatred for Donald Trump. We both are, as old Senate hands, believe that we need to preserve the filibuster, right? And that means you need 60 votes to get something done. And so what that means is when you've got 53 Republicans in the Senate, you need 7 Democrats who are going to come over and say, Donald Trump, I want to work with you. I disagree with you on a lot of stuff, but here's the thing that I agree with you on, and I'll help you do it. And there are not 7 Democrats in the Senate who are willing to do that on a lot of these issues. And so therefore, there's no chance for Congress to do anything. And so, if it's something that's non-controversial, they might agree. But if anything that's controversial, nobody's going to cross the aisle to do it. And so we're stuck. And so as a result, we don't want to get rid of the 60 vote threshold because then that will be an absolute disaster. But sometimes it's better for Congress to do nothing than to do a lot of stuff if you unleash the floodgates and got rid of even the last modicum of bipartisanship.
Well, I agree with you about the filibuster, but I think Congress's brokenness predates Donald Trump. This
Sure.
has been a downhill trajectory.
But it's reached its apex.
But yes, but it is, as my friend Ruel likes to say, it is becoming asymptotic with zero. And, look, it's bad for our Constitution. It's bad for our country. It's bad for the balance of powers. And I want to see them do it. And I want to see them do stuff even if I disagree with it. I want to see Congress act. The fact that we couldn't get the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act passed last
God.
year. I mean, for F's sake. Really? We're hostile to the
You were going to say, for
Anti-Semitism
Christ's sake, we
Awareness
can't
Act?
get the Anti-Semitism Act passed.
I was going to say that. You know me too well. Oh, well. Anyway, and on that elevated religious note, let me say thank you,
Holy
everybody,
Moses.
for listening. Let us know what you think. And Holy Moses.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.